Hello, my name is Mark Kantrowitz. I am Senior Vice President and Publisher of Advisors.com. Today's talk is about how to evaluate financial aid award letters. Most financial aid award letters arrive in late March or early April. They can be quite confusing for families. The goal of this talk is to help you understand how to evaluate these award letters so that you can make a more informed decision about the trade-offs between college cost and affordability and other factors such as college quality, and to help you understand the difference between financial fit and academic fit or other measures of an individual's fit to a particular college. So the goal is to help you compare colleges on a true apples to apples basis and what it's really going to cost you. So award letters can be very confusing. They don't provide enough information, and the information that's provided can be, in some ways, quite misleading. Uh, Almost a third of college financial aid award letters don't even mention the cost of attendance. They often will list only the direct costs, such as tuition and fees, but those are costs that are paid directly to the college. About half of the college costs at public colleges are direct costs, but the rest, such as room and board, books and supplies, aren't paid directly to the college, and those can vary from one college to the next. And you need to be able to have the similar information about each college so that you can compare them on an equal basis. So this forces you to search on the college's website or course catalog to get information about all the college costs. And often the information about particular items can be quite low, like textbook pricing and transportation costs are often lowball. They're often figures are much lower than students typically experience because it makes the college look cheaper. Now, about 3/5 of financial aid award letters don't include any information about the loan terms. They might list a loan, but they won't give you any signal that it's a loan. They won't list the interest rates, they won't list the term in years, they won't list whether it's subsidized or unsubsidized. It's just treated the same as they would treat a grant, often leading to confusion between loans and grants. They may not even use the word loan. They may use an acronym like L or LN or not use any word at all. So families will often confuse the grants with the loans, thinking that they're getting a free ride, when in fact there is a $20,000 Parent Plus loan and an unsubsidized Stafford loan for $5,000, and so far from being a free ride, it's one of the more expensive colleges. And There's this concept of a net cost or a net price, which we'll discuss in the future. Many of these award letters don't even list a net price or a net cost to give you any kind of sense of how much the college is really going to cost. So when I've surveyed students and parents in the past, about 7/8 of students and parents say that financial aid award letters should be standardized to make them easier to understand and to compare. Now, as we discussed in the previous slide, there are direct costs and there are indirect costs. And the direct costs include tuition fees that are paid to the school. In some cases, room and board is paid to the school because students living on campus. And sometimes textbooks and supplies are bundled into the tuition cost. So there's one comprehensive bill. Indirect costs are not paid to the school and are to some extent discretionary. Travel to and from school, like airplane tickets versus train tickets to get there if you're going out of state, miscellaneous personal expenses, cost of a computer, student health insurance, dependent care. All of these are more discretionary in nature, and sometimes they're left off of the award letter. So you need to make sure that all of these cost components are included on the award letter, or that you have that information so that you can take them into account in your analysis of the college costs. Now, the indirect costs, because they're under your discretionary control, are a potential source of savings. But you should make sure that you're doing a kind of apples to apples comparison so that if, for example, you're buying textbooks at the two colleges, And one list of textbooks that's costing only $100 a semester and the other is $500 a semester, you make sure that you're using a realistic figure for comparing the colleges. So you don't want to go to a college that gives you misleading information about the textbook costs only to discover later that the college was a lot more expensive than you thought. Now, there are several different types of financial aid, and these can be broadly classified into gift aid and self-help aid. The main distinction is gift aid is money that does not need to be repaid. It actually reduces your costs, whereas self-help aid includes loans, student employment. The loans don't reduce your costs, they spread them out over time. Now, few people can afford to pay the college bill all at once, but still, in characterizing a loan as reducing your costs is misleading because you're still going to pay it, you're just going to pay it in the future as opposed to right now. Now, you need to focus on trying to minimize that debt. And live like a student while you're in school so you don't have to live like a student after you graduate. You want to have your total student loan debt at graduation be less than your annual starting salary. If your total debt is less than your annual income, you'll be able to pay back those student loans in 10 years or less. But when we're looking at college costs, there's this concept of a net price or a net cost that involves subtracting different forms of financial aid from the total college cost. So this slide shows you the difference between the net cost and the net price. The net cost is what you get when you subtract the entire financial aid package, including the loans, from the cost of attendance. But loans have to be repaid, so they're not really reducing your costs. A better figure is the net price, which is what you get when you subtract just the grants, the money that does not need to be repaid, from the cost of attendance. That's a much better bottom line figure for your true college costs. Now, colleges may tend to report a net cost as opposed to a net price figure because it makes the college look more affordable. But when you're comparing colleges, you need to focus on the net price because that's like a discounted sticker price. It's the amount of money you're going to have to pay from your savings, from your income, from loans in order to cover those college costs. And as I mentioned before, and I've heard from families who think that they're getting a free ride because they have a net cost of zero, when in fact the net price may be in the tens of thousands of dollars. Loans do not cut your college costs, they simply make it easier to pay the bill. They give you cash flow assistance, but they're not discounting the price. Now, to calculate the net price, it's pretty straightforward. First, you have to make sure you identify the full cost of attendance. That's tuition, fees, room and board, books and supplies, transportation, cost of a computer, and other expenses related to your education. And make sure that you're including every single cost that any of the colleges list, so that you're not comparing one college that includes room and board in its cost of attendance and another college that does not. Add together all your grants and scholarships, all the gift aid that's listed on the award letter, and be careful to identify what really is gift aid and what is a loan or student employment, because you don't want to think that a loan is a grant when in fact it isn't, because a grant reduces your costs, loans do not. Subtract the total amount of gift aid from the total cost of attendance. That is your net price, and you should compare the colleges based on the net price. There are a lot of potential though for confusion between the net price and the net cost. In the past survey that I did when I was at FastWeb, we had a survey about net price calculators, and we found that we asked the students whether their net price estimate was close to the expected family contribution figure. And we were asking this several months beyond their initial calculation of the net price. And a significant percentage of the students, more than a third, said yes, they were the same. But it turns out that the net cost figure is similar to the net price, to the expected family contribution. The net price is not. So someone saying that yes, the net price was similar to the expected family contribution is misremembering a net cost figure as though it were a net price. So there's a lot of confusion going on, which makes it likely that this is influencing families' decisions about where to go, even though it's not really reflecting their the true college costs, and so maybe not reflecting their ability to pay. Now, there are still some problems with the net price. It is not a perfect measure. About half of all colleges practice front loading of grants, where they give a better mix of grants versus loans during the first year than during subsequent years. In some ways, it's a form of bait and switch. They're giving you a lower discounted price your first year, and in subsequent years, you're not getting as many grants. And so your net price your first year is lower than in subsequent years. And you want to make sure you're aware of that, because you may have a very low net price this year, but in the overall scheme of things, it may ultimately be about the same price as this other college. The other has to do with if you've won a lot of private scholarships, you want to ask the college about its outside scholarship policy. When a student is receiving need-based aid and wins a private scholarship, the school has to reduce the need-based aid package to compensate. Now, they have two ways of doing this. If they've got loans, they could reduce the loans, so you'd be replacing a loan with a grant. If they have grants, they could replace the grants with your private scholarship, in which case you get no net financial gain. Obviously, it's to your benefit to have them replace the loans. So depending on the college's policy, whether they reduce loans first or grants first, you may benefit financially. If they're replacing the loans with your private scholarship, they're reducing the net price. If they're replacing their own grants with your scholarship, your net price remains unchanged. So you need to make sure that you're taking that into account when comparing two different colleges, because if you have two colleges with the same initial net price, but one has a more favorable outside scholarship policy, you may end up with a much less expensive college with the one that has a more favorable policy. Now, sometimes when you ask a college to practice front loading of grants, they play dumb. They say, well, it depends on if your circumstances are the same in subsequent years, in which case you could answer and assume they're the same, but they know what you're asking about, and sometimes you're not going to get a straight answer. It's unfortunate. But there is another way of getting at this information. You can ask an upperclassman how their grants as a junior or senior compared with their grants as a freshman. Oftentimes, if the college is practicing front loading of grants, it'll be quite obvious to them that they had less grants. You can also go to College Navigator or other websites that list the average grant for a freshman versus average grant for all undergraduate students, and you compare the two. It'll be obvious if there's a significant difference in those grants. So ask a question like, assuming that my financial circumstances are the same in subsequent years, how will my grants change from one year to the next? Do you practice front loading the grants? And see if they give an honest answer. Some do, some don't. Now, differences in the net price can have an impact on the family's choice of where to go to college. In most cases, you're going to have a similar net cost across the colleges, but the net price may differ significantly from one college to the next. When talking with families, I found that if the net price differs by less than $1,000, they're going to go to the college that has the better perceived fit, as opposed to the better financial fit. Because $1,000 isn't going to make that much of a difference, especially considering that it'll fluctuate from one year to the next, and it's not a big piece of the overall college cost. If the difference, though, is more than $5,000, families will go to the college with a lower cost, because $5,000 per year, 4 years, that's $20,000 of additional debt. That makes a big difference in the affordability of the college. And in between those figures, they agonize over the decision. The net price of a college does tend to correlate very well with the student loan debt at graduation. So you could take your net price your first year, figure out what percentage of that you're going to end up having to borrow, multiply that by the length of your educational program, and that'll be within about 15% of your debt at graduation. Overall, net price is going to be lowest at two types of colleges: in-state public colleges and colleges that have a generous no loans financial aid policy, where your financial aid package doesn't include any loans. And at those colleges, your net cost and your net price will probably be the same, since they're both subtracting the full amount of the financial aid package, which is entirely grants and some student employment, from the cost of attendance. There's about 6 dozen colleges with very generous no loans financial aid policies. They include all of the Ivy League institutions and several very selective educational institutions. So it's hard to get in to get that benefit. Now, something else to be aware of is called gapping. It's when a school doesn't meet the student's full demonstrated financial need, but instead leaves them with some unmet need or a gap. Students who are left with unmet need are often forced to borrow to fill that gap. Now, some colleges will do what's called packaging plus. They'll include the Parent Plus loan, the federal Parent Plus loan, on the financial aid award letter as though it's a form of need-based financial aid, and that'll mask the presence of a gap. But when you look at the net price, it's going to give you a truer picture, and these kind of games to make the net cost look lower won't work on a net price basis. So tend to focus on the net price more than the net cost. Now I'm going to give an example of a problematic financial aid award letter. Hopefully you can read this. I'll give some of the detail. This is actually a blend of two real financial aid award letters, but I eliminated the design elements in the institution names to protect the guilty. So the first thing is you'll notice it's got only the tuition and fees. It doesn't include any indirect costs, such as room and board, books and supplies, transportation, personal expenses. That understates the actual cost of attending the college. The check to the college might be just under $10,000 in the end, but the actual cost of the family is going to be much, much higher than this figure. And colleges often say, well, that's the costs that are being paid to us. Well, the financial aid is not just based on the direct costs, it's also based on the full cost of attendance. So limiting the financial aid award letter is basically about misleading the family. The next thing to notice is that they have a Federal Perkins L listed after the Fed Pell Grant. They have then another grant, and they have a Fed Sub Staff college grant, and then a Fed Unsub Staff, and then a Parent Plus L. Well, the college said that they had a 15-character limit on the award names, and so they had to abbreviate. Well, that's convenient, and who decides that there's 15 characters? It's the school. And so the Fed Perkins L is a federal Perkins loan. L stands for loan. The sub-staff, which I didn't even mention the letter L, is a subsidized federal education loan. The Fed Unsub Staff is the federal unsubsidized Stafford loan, another loan where the government doesn't pay the interest while you're in school. And the Parent Plus L is, again, another loan. So even though there's a total financial aid of $31,000 here, most of that is actually in the form of loans, not grants. And it mixes these loans and grants in a seemingly random order, so it blends it all together, making it easier to confuse grants with loans. And you see, first thing you see is a grant, you might assume everything else is a grant. Now, what's really going on here is they're first listing need-based aid and then non-need-based aid, but let's face it, a loan is a loan is a loan. It has to be repaid, usually with interest. It does not reduce your college costs. I mean, you should think of loans as an option for financing the net price, not as something that makes the college less expensive. And then finally, the expected net cost figure at the end is subtracting the entire financial aid package from the cost of attendance. And in this case, the cost of attendance doesn't include the full cost, as opposed to a net price figure. And so this yields a much lower figure that may make it seem more affordable to the family. And something else worth noticing is that they did a non-zero figure, even though the Parent Plus loan could be up to the full cost of attendance. And that's perhaps because they expected the family might come up with money from savings. But the reality is that the family looks at this and says, oh, $10,000, I can handle that. When in reality, it's a lot of debt, and it's there to make it look like this college is a lot less expensive than it is. And the net cost of zero might cause the family to question it, whereas a $10,000 that fits in with most people's preconceptions about college costs may not. And also notice that none of these loans have any other signal as to the fact that they're loans. No interest rates, no loan terms, no monthly payment figures. Now, here's what I get when I improve this award letter by trying to provide more informative details. First of all, the cost of attendance includes all the elements of the cost of attendance, so it's a more accurate, higher figure. I separate out all the gift aid, all the grants, and give a total for that. Subtract the grants from the cost of attendance to obtain the net price. And then I show the loans as options for satisfying that net price, including details as to the interest rates, the monthly payments, so make you have better information. And when you look at the net price, you got $46,000 in change instead of $10,000. That's a big difference. And that shows you why colleges do this, because it makes the college look more affordable. And I think that's quite misleading. Now, the federal government has introduced this concept of a financial aid shopping sheet, which is similar concepts. It's focusing on the net price, highlighting the grants, highlighting the total cost of attendance, so that you have a standardized award letter or award letter summary that you can use to compare different colleges. This was the result of some efforts by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the U.S. Department of Education because of a law passed by Congress in 2008 mandating the creation of this financial aid shopping sheet. And the goal is to allow you to compare different colleges on an apples-to-apples basis so that you can have a good understanding of what the true cost of the college is. Right now, this is a voluntary requirement. Congress and the administration have not required every college to have one of these. So far, about a third of all colleges have adopted the financial aid shopping sheet, a total of 1,950 as of December of 2013. There is pending legislation that would make it mandatory, but that legislation hasn't moved out of committee in Congress, and it's unclear whether it will, but I hope that it will, because I mean, it does you no good to compare two colleges if one's adopted the shopping sheet and the other hasn't. You can still do the same kind of analysis, but it's more work for you, and there's more potential for errors and confusion. So now here's some questions that you should ask college financial aid administrators as you're trying to evaluate the affordability of a college. And the first is, do you meet the full demonstrated financial need? Or is there a gap? Is there unmet need? What is your outside scholarship policy? How do you reduce the need-based financial aid package when a student wins a private scholarship? Do you reduce loan and work burden, or do you substitute it for your own grants and scholarships? If yes, and do you, how do you practice front-loaded grants? And the answer is, how will the grants change from one year to the next, all else being equal, if your financial circumstances remain the same? Do college costs increase each year? The answer is probably yes, though some public colleges go through feast-famine cycles where they'll have no tuition increase for the next few years, and then there'll be a much bigger increase. There are some colleges that have guaranteed tuitions or tuition locks where the tuition is the same every single year, but your financial aid might change as well. And there's only one college that I'm aware of that has a net price lock, which tries to keep the student's net price the same from one year to the next, all else being equal. What percentage of the students at the school graduate with debt, and what is the average cumulative debt at graduation? Some of the colleges provide that information. You can go to projectonstudentdebt.org to get that information, but about half of all colleges don't provide that information. And more important question is, what percentage of the students graduate with unaffordable debt? No college tracks that, to my knowledge. What are the requirements for keeping grants and scholarships in future years? Are the scholarships renewable, or are they just one time for the freshman year? Do you need to maintain a minimum GPA? Do you need to enroll full-time or take a particular number of units? Or is half-time enrollment okay? Do you need to participate in special activities like community service in order to retain eligibility for this financial aid? What are the residency requirements for in-state college tuition? Is it a year of residence before, 2 years? Do your parents have to live there? And what are the requirements? How many hours will you have to work to get the full work-study award that you've been promised on the award letter? How much will you be paid per hour? Are the jobs readily available, or are they oversubscribed, which is often the case? I mean, are you guaranteed to get a job? And what kind of a job will you get? Is it going to be serving food in the cafeteria, shelving books in the library, or working on a research project with a faculty member? And how often will you be paid? How will you be paid? Is your student account credited? Are you sent a check? Are you paid directly? I know a lot of details there. Now, if you have unusual family financial circumstances, how do you appeal for more aid? And that's very important, that if there's anything that distinguishes you from the typical family, or anything that changed from last year to this year, ask the college how do you appeal for more aid. It's often called a professional judgment review or special circumstances review. Each college has its own process, but you can bring these to their attention and have them make adjustments. And it's entirely up to the discretion of the college financial aid administrator, but if the circumstances affect the family's ability to pay, many colleges will make an adjustment if it's something that was beyond the family's control. And another question you could ask is, what is the impact of cost increases and sequestration and other events on the amount of financial aid that you're receiving? And if costs go up, will your financial aid go up? Usually the answer is yes, but maybe that increase is going to be more in the form of loans than in the form of grants. So now, when you appeal for more financial aid, if you're seeking a professional judgment review, one thing to be aware of, that if you have different net cost figures, and I'm saying net cost deliberately here, as opposed to net price figures, if your net cost is different in the two schools, because net cost should be similar to the EFC, the expected family contribution, that may be a signal that one college took something into account that the others didn't. So was there a piece of information about your family's circumstances that you told to one college but not to the other? So make sure that you tell all the colleges that you're considering with copies of documentation of your special circumstances, these unusual family financial circumstances that affect your ability to pay. Examples of a special circumstance could include job loss. Last year you had a job, this year you don't. Salary reductions, high unreimbursed medical and dental expenses, high dependent care costs, private secondary school tuition, death of a wage earner. There are a lot of unusual circumstances, but those are some of the more common, and unfortunately more common circumstances. Some colleges use the CSS financial aid profile form to award their own financial aid, and there's a question on that form that asks about unusual circumstances. Colleges that use just the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA, might not know about the same bit of information. So make sure you keep all the colleges informed about your unusual circumstances. Now, if the net price differs by a lot, it's more a sign of differences in generosity of the college, as opposed to taking into account unusual circumstances. So some colleges, if they're trying to recruit a student, will give a better mix of financial aid to that student, or as opposed to this issue with unusual circumstances. But it doesn't hurt to ask for more aid if you're polite about it and you give a reason why they should, such as you had these unusual circumstances, you're academically talented. Now, with the professional judgment review, that usually is submitted to the financial aid office, whereas appeals for an academic scholarship, that's usually through the admissions office. And I mentioned on the slide that another reason is preferential packaging, and it's usually focused on students who either have a very specific academic talent, or in some cases to students who are wealthier, because the college could give money to a discount to students who are wealthier and still pay less for that student. That student's a full pay student, so they're providing more income to the school than a low income student who needs a lot of financial aid. And definitely ask about academic scholarships if you have a very strong academic background, especially at second and third tier schools. they try to recruit students who are more academically talented, not only to raise the profile of the school, but because part of the educational environment is not just the faculty in the classrooms teaching lectures, but it's your peers, your fellow students. They make up a lot of the character of the school, and so if you improve the quality of the student body, you're improving the educational experience for all the students. Now, a couple of tips on ways that you can cut college costs now that you know that the net price is pretty high and that you're going to have to pay a lot to cover your college costs. And as I hinted before, your indirect costs are under your discretionary control. So you could go home from school fewer times per year if you're living out of state. So instead of going home during the 4 breaks, spring break, summer break, Thanksgiving break, and winter break, you could go home just for the major holidays. And that would be a way of saving on your travel expenses. Now, of course, one of the best ways of saving college costs is to enroll at a cheaper college. And obviously, by the time you're already enrolled in the school, it's too late to change that. But when you're trying to make your decision of where to go, at that point, you can compare the net price. And I would recommend that in your initial set of schools to which you're applying, you include a financial aid safety school, which is a school that will not only admit you, but where you could afford to attend even if you got no financial aid from the school. And try to not only focus on the reaching school and the schools that you have a good chance of getting into, but also apply to a variety of schools so that you have a good chance of getting a reasonable financial aid package. Because it does you no good to get into that $50,000 or $60,000 a year school if you're denied the financial aid that you need to be able to afford the college. Because you'll either drop out because you run out of money, or you'll end up graduating with too much debt, and that'll affect your future options. And people who graduate with too much debt are forced to take the job that pays better as opposed to the job that's a better fit for their goals, and they tend to delay life cycle events like buying a car, buying a house, getting married, having children, saving for retirement, saving for their children's college educations. So other things that you can do to save on college costs include buying cheaper textbooks and used textbooks, selling your textbooks back to the bookstore at the end of the semester, shopping around online to try to find a less expensive version of the textbook, renting textbooks, e-books, a lot of options for saving on textbook costs. And especially at the public colleges, they can represent a significant portion of your college costs, costing $1,000 to $2,000 on average. If you're living near to school, if you're going to school in state, you could live at home to save on college costs, the dormitory costs, or you could get a roommate to split the cost of rent, and those are ways of saving on college costs. There is some benefit, though, if it's a residential college, of living on campus, because, as I said, their educational experience is not just sitting in classroom lectures, it's interacting with your peers and learning from the friends that you develop throughout your college career. And I'd also suggest searching for scholarships on free scholarship matching sites like studentscholarshipsearch.com and my previous site, fastweb.com. Other things that you could do is try to graduate in 3 years instead of 4. Often a full-time workload is not enough for you to graduate in 4 years, so maybe this should be graduate in 4 years instead of 5 or 6 years. Or if you're going for 4 years and you're taking extra classes, get 2 degrees for the one price, double major, and get 2 bachelor's degrees. One thing to be aware of is that once you have earned finished all the requirements for obtaining a bachelor's degree, you lose eligibility for certain forms of federal student aid. So if your goal is to get 2 bachelor's degrees, make sure that you juggle the requirements so that you don't finish the requirements for either degree until the last semester, so that you'll continue to get financial aid throughout your college career. You can take an extra class each academic term to do this. You can enroll in classes during the summer semester, or you can use AP, CLEP, and PEP tests to get advanced credit for work you did in high school. Another way of cutting college costs is to get a summer job. Many colleges have a summer work expectation, so your financial aid is based on an assumption that you're going to earn $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 during the summer, and the federal formula allows you to earn as a student up to a little bit more than $6,000 uh, throughout the year without affecting your financial aid, your federal EFC. Some colleges, for their own aid, may have stricter definitions, but for the federal aid, you can earn up to $6,000 and use that to help pay for your school. So thank you. Just a little bit about advisors, and we publish a group of websites about planning and paying for college, and we're in the process of overhauling the content of those sites. So you should start seeing some really good content coming out on our sites. We are almost ready to release a new book called Filing the FAFSA on completing the free application for federal student aid. It's over 200 pages. We will be making a PDF version, Adobe Acrobat version of this book available for free on advisors.com. And we'll start working on the site sometime next week. If you like a Kindle or print versions, those will be sold through Amazon.com. And if you want to see articles that I write and materials that help people figure out how to pay for school and tip sheets, follow me on Twitter at mcant. And whenever I post something new to the sites, I'll be posting it to Twitter. So thank you, and we'll open it up to questions now. Kelly says, is it possible to be in an RA the same year you transfer? And that's something that's specific to each individual college. In many cases, the colleges will want resident assistants to be people who have experience with the college, so that they're advising the freshmen in the dormitory about options on campus. So a transfer student may not have the experience that a college requires in order to be able to provide counseling and advice to the students. So I think a lot of colleges will be more restrictive on providing this to transfer students who, like freshmen, are just getting used to the college environment. Okay. Susan asks, is there a limit to the amount of schools you can apply to? On the free application for federal student aid, the paper version has spaces for 4 schools. The online version, which is available at fafsa.ed.gov, has spaces for 10 schools. Now let's suppose that you're applying to more than 10 schools and you want them to get your financial aid information. Once you receive your student aid report back from the federal government, that's a sign that the schools have received what's called, it's their version of the SAR, the student aid report. It's called the ISER, the Institutional Student Information Record. And at that point in time, you can go on fafsa.ed.gov, delete the existing schools and put in new school codes, and those new schools will receive the information that's on your FAFSA. Now it's worth noting that every school that's ever received your FAFSA that year can see the full list of the other colleges that you're listing on the FAFSA, and this can affect your aid eligibility. What I recommend doing is that you take your first choice school and you list it second or third, and you put your second choice school in the first slot, because that may increase your likelihood of getting into that school if they see that you're putting them more prominently. There's one caveat to that, which is if you're applying to a state school, an in-state school, and you want to get aid at that school, some of the schools will require you to list them first. So if you're applying to a public college in-state, list that college first, and then list your your other second choice school in the second space. Then a question from Alessandro: do out-of-state universities give less out-of-state, pulling up the full question, students less money to out-of-state students based on financial need than in-state students? Well, the first thing is out-of-state students at a public college are going to pay a higher tuition, and the reason for that is that the college is trying to use that to help balance its budget so that it doesn't have to increase the tuition for its in-state students as much. So you may find that colleges are less generous to out-of-state students. But a lot depends on your particular state. And there are some states where, like Pennsylvania, where going to an in-state school is as expensive as going to an out-of-state public college in another state. Let's see, a question from Bobby Joe. Will scholarship committees favor an IB diploma graduate over traditional graduation when you take an exemplary student with a 4.5 GPA? Captain of golf team, lots of extracurricular activities. Will the schools offer more financial aid in order to obtain the student a private college per se? It depends very much on the individual college. Certainly academic excellence is going to help you get into a college, and at some colleges that are trying to improve their profile, they may focus on students with higher GPAs and higher SAT scores, the number of valedictorians and salutatorians, but it also helps to be strong in other areas. Now, this idea of a well-rounded student, if everybody at the school played the oboe, lettered in a sport, and was captain of the math team, it would be kind of boring. So it's more a well-rounded student body that they're looking for than a well-rounded student. They want to see excellence. Rather than being a jack of all trades and doing okay in a lot of different fields, pick a few things to excel in. Excel in academics, and pick one hobby to pursue in depth. Depth is more important than breadth in that regard. See, Christian says, I'm a veteran planning to go to school in a high-cost private school. I'm using my GI Bill. How is my financially affected? Will my military benefit act against me to get less aid? Well, first of all, the GI Bill does not affect your federal aid, and there's this yellow ribbon program that helps benefit veterans, recent veterans, to get more favorable financial aid from colleges. So I wouldn't be all that concerned. There is an office on most college campuses that's intended to help support veterans. It's sometimes called the Veteran Guidance Office. Talk to the school, ask them, and speak to that person, and they'll let you know how veterans have fared on the college campus. There are some colleges out there that cater veterans, that see it's part of the way of giving back to veterans, to make sure that they provide extra support to these students who have given to our country. Kyle says, what if your child is applying to a state school out of state? Should we put the #1 school second? Yes, you should put the #1 school second, because that school is probably a reach school. It's probably very competitive. Putting it first isn't going to do you any good in terms of increasing your likelihood of getting in if the school pays attention to who their competitors are. Whereas your second school, it may make more of an influence. And there are some schools who won't admit you if they see that you have a good chance of getting into a school that you've listed earlier in the list on the FAFSA. So you need to be a little bit careful about that. And some people say list them in alphabetical order. I don't think that does any good. I think that you need to focus on your top 3 slots and try to do it strategically to improve your chance of getting in and getting a reasonable financial aid offer. Evan says, I've been accepted to a few different colleges. Some mentioned a dollar amount to help, but others didn't. What's the best way to see where you will get the most financial help? Will FAFSA affect that amount, or is the additional dollars to use towards tuition? What the colleges do is they're looking at your ability to pay. There's this measure called the expected family contribution. They subtract that from the cost of attendance to determine your demonstrated financial need. Now, some colleges will have 2 different expected family contribution, or EFC, figures. One is the federal figure, and one is a figure that is calculated by the college based on their own formula, such as through the CSS financial aid profile form. And so you may have different financial need figures, and so the college will be basing its awards on its financial need figure and the federal aid on the federal EFC figure. And they're assembling this into a package. Oftentimes the federal aid isn't enough to cover the full college cost, so the college is supplementing that. But they're not going to each provide you with enough money to pay for the entire college cost. You can't go to college and make a profit unless you have so many outside scholarships and you don't get any other financial aid, in which case you might get some financial aid that um, goes beyond just the financial need and includes part of your expected family contribution. But that's very rare, and we're talking a few hundred students a year who get a completely free ride through private scholarships. Okay. And then there is a question from someone who did not give their name. If you were not born in the United States, but you have, through President Obama's DREAM Act, a social security number, are you still considered an international student? And the answer is, if you are not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident or a certain very limited eligible non-citizens, you're not eligible for federal student aid. But there is, and eventually you will be able to normalize your citizenship perhaps, and then you would be eligible for federal student aid. But if you don't have a green card and you're not certain very rare circumstances like people from certain American territories like the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republic of Palau and American Samoa, or certain people granted permanent asylum status, you're not going to be eligible for federal student aid if you're not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. And then Anthony says, I have 2 children who will be in college as a freshman and sophomore. Will the sophomore's age change when his brother enters college? Probably. The federal need analysis formula divides the parent contribution of the expected family contribution by the number of children in college at the same time. So all else being equal, each child's expected family contribution will go down and their aid will go up. And that's because the formula is very heavily weighted towards income, not assets. So just because you have 2 children in college doesn't mean you have twice as much money to pay for their education. The CSS financial aid profile has a similar effect, but instead of dividing by the number of children, it's a smaller reduction in the EFC. So instead of a 50% reduction for 2 children in college, it's only a 40% reduction. And there's a schedule of how they reduce the EFC accordingly. But you should, and oftentimes I hear from families, this first child went to college, they got no need-based aid other than loans, and they said the next year, why bother? But that year they would have had 2 children in college, and if they had applied, they would have received much more financial aid. I usually give an example with my brothers. My older brother has twins, my younger brother has children separated in ages by 4 years. So if they had both the same income and assets, my older brother, because he will have multiple children in school at the same time, will get more financial aid than my younger brother. Question from Kyle. My dad is disabled and receives Social Security benefits. Will this affect my getting federal grants and loans? My mom works for a nonprofit and doesn't make much. Certain types of disability benefits are excluded on the FAFSA, certain are not. SSI is excluded, SSDI is not. And you'll have to look at the individual EFC when you file the FAFSA to see what the impact is. But it can make a difference. You should still appeal for a professional judgment review pointing out that your father is disabled, noting any special medical expenses that he has associated with that disability, any special accommodations that he needs, and perhaps they'll be able to take it into account. Or if there are other circumstances and they can't make an adjustment because of the disability, they'll still put them in a frame of mind where they're more likely to give you the benefit of doubt on the other changes. Okay. Christian asks, I want to submit my FAFSA, but as the months go by, I will be applying for scholarships. Do I have to report these awards to FAFSA or to school? Well, first of all, file your FAFSA as soon as possible after January 1st, I think now, if you can. There are several states and several colleges that have very early deadlines, and there are 2 states that have February deadlines for filing the FAFSA. to qualify for state aid, and there are 7 or 8 states where the money is awarded on a first come, first served basis until it runs out. So the sooner you apply, the fewer deadlines you'll miss, and potentially the more money you'll be able to qualify for. But when you receive a private scholarship, you have to notify the school. It's part of the school's rules, and they will, and depending on the nature of their outside scholarship policy, they may reduce your need-based aid package, and it may be a reduction in loans, or it may be a reduction in grants. But you have to report this to the school. If you don't, and it's discovered later, it can cause all sorts of problems. Like they would have to return some of your aid money to the federal government, or they'll, in the subsequent year, they'll give you a lower proportion of grant aid because you didn't report this grant that you received. You may end up owing a refund of a grant to the federal government, in which case they won't be able to disperse new aid until you have actually made arrangements to repay the grant overpayment. So keep the college, as soon as you know that you're receiving a scholarship, let the financial aid office know about it. Matthew asks, we make good income and have investments which make an EFC very high, but with bankruptcy with our employer, we had our retirement taken away, so investments have to make up for this. We cannot use this money for college. What are we to do? On paper, it looks like we can afford the EFC, but we cannot. Is this a special circumstance? I mean, certainly it doesn't hurt to appeal, but retirement benefits aren't a reportable asset on the FAFSA. It's ignored, it's sheltered. So the college is going to be a little bit reluctant to make an adjustment for non-existent retirement benefits, given that the retirement benefits wouldn't have factored into the figure in the first place. And even if you have investments that are not in qualified retirement plans, and you intend to use them for retirement, intention isn't a requirement that you use them for retirement, even if you're actually already retired. So the colleges are very unlikely to make an adjustment for this, but it doesn't hurt to ask and be polite about it, because there's no appeal beyond them. And if they think you're trying to game the system, then they'll say no. But if you're polite and you explain the circumstances, you provide documentation, maybe you'll be lucky and they'll make an adjustment. Kyle asked, do universities and colleges give more to freshmen than to sophomores, juniors, and seniors? Do we need to reapply for all 3 years? You do need to reapply every single year. You have to file the FAFSA every single year, because it's awarding aid 1 year at a time, taking into account any changes in your income and assets. And about half of all colleges give more money to freshmen than to juniors, and sophomore, juniors, and seniors. This is what I referred to earlier as front loading of grants. So you need to be aware of that and ask the college what their practices are, so that if you get a very good offer from one school and you're comparing it to another school and one front loads the grants and the other doesn't, you can take this into account when you're looking at the affordability. Now, this doesn't mean that you should decide which college you're going to solely based on the net price, and there are other factors. But the idea is you need to be able to make an informed decision based on the affordability of the college, so that you can weigh that against the other factors and not be making a decision based on a net cost figure that doesn't really reflect how affordable the college is. So you'll trade off, and you have two colleges that one is a better reputation, but you'll end up with a much higher net price, and you weigh, is it worth spending an extra few $1,000s a year to go to a college that has a better reputation? Okay, Evan's asking, what is CSS? Is that the same as FAFSA? The CSS financial aid profile form is a form that's through the college board. It is not the same as the FAFSA. It includes overall more than twice as many questions. The core questions are about 60% more questions than the FAFSA, so it's a much more invasive form. And it's designed to try to prevent wealthy students from looking as though they're poor by asking much more detailed questions than the FAFSA. About 250 mostly private colleges use the CSS financial aid profile form for awarding their own financial aid. Um, they still use the FAFSA for awarding federal and state aid, and the other colleges, many of them will use the FAFSA for awarding their own aid, or they might have a supplemental form to get more information about special circumstances, like if the student's parents happen to be divorced, is the non-custodial parent willing to help pay for the school? Susan asks, when applying for scholarships, what is meant by need-based? Is there a typical income range? Most scholarships are going to be based on some kind of merit, such as academic, athletic, or artistic talent, but some will have a need-based component where they're looking at whether you need financial assistance to be able to afford the college. And usually, financial need is a very harsh definition of your ability to pay. It assumes that you can pay a lot more than most families think that they can pay. But it's basically a prioritization system or a way of capping the amount of aid that they give. It's not based directly on income, rather it's based on the expected family contribution, which combines information about income, assets, family size, number of students in college, the age of the older parent, to determine the family's financial strength. As far as the Pell Grant, 96% of Pell Grant recipients have family adjusted gross income of under $50,000. But that doesn't mean that you can't get a Pell Grant if you have $100,000 in income or more. Depends on how many children are in college and other factors. What is the cost of the college is another factor in eligibility for other forms of financial aid, such as the subsidized Stafford loan. Financial need is the difference between college cost and the expected family contribution. So a higher college cost will increase your financial need. A lower EFC increases your financial need. So a middle income family that goes to a higher cost college may qualify for a subsidized Stafford loan, whereas a low income student at a very low cost college might not, simply because the financial need might be, in fact, lower at the lower cost school. Okay, Matthew asks, what does an EFC of 41,600 mean? We just received this from the FAFSA. 41,600, you think of that as a dollar amount, and that's subtracted from the cost of attendance of the school. And so that's saying that the FAFSA believes that you can afford to contribute at least $41,600 towards your college education. It means you're probably not going to get much financial aid at an in-state public college. You might get some at a private college or an out-of-state college, but that is a relatively high EFC. It's a sign of some financial strength in the family. And so Joshua asks a similar question. If the family's EFC is higher than the school's cost of attendance, does that mean that the student should not expect any financial aid from the school for that school year? The answer is need-based aid, you won't get any. But in some cases, the schools will do what's called leveraging, where they'll be awarding non-need-based aid, such as a non-need-based grant, or some schools will call it a merit grant, to try to attract you to enroll at the school. The idea being that, let's say you're at you're getting this merit grant, $10,000 at a $50,000 a year school. Well, if you enroll at that school and you're still paying them net $40,000 a year, which may be more than they're receiving from 2 or 3 low-income students. And so financially, it is better for the school to have a few higher-paying students, even if that means giving them a discount. And plus, that discount gets magnified in the retelling to be a full ride and a merit-based scholarship, and very prestigious university just gave your child this wonderful award. And so that it boosts the family's ego and makes them more likely to enroll, even though the family might pay less at a perfectly fine in-state public college. And I encourage you to focus a lot on in-state public colleges, because many of these are really great institutions. And let's run down a list. I mean, UC Berkeley, UCLA, UCSD in California, Ohio State, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, UMass Amherst. You can get a very good quality education at these schools, comparable to that of an Ivy League institution. at much lower cost. I mean, it's a way of getting a great quality education at a bargain price. Uh, Alexander says we already submitted this CSS for 2014 based on estimated income. How can this be adjusted based on actual income tax filed, as the estimate was different from actually submitted tax return? You can go in and you can correct it. With the FAFSA, you need to file the FAFSA as soon as possible as well, and you do that based on estimated income and tax information. Your last pay stub of the year, your 1099 and W-2 forms, the previous year's federal income tax return, and then you will be required to update it when you file your federal income tax return. With the FAFSA, there is a special tool called the IRS Data Retrieval Tool, which allows you a week or two after you file your federal income tax return, if you file it electronically, to copy the information from your 1040 into, or 1040A or 1040EZ into the FAFSA. And there are some questions that exactly correspond to the information on the federal income tax return. And when you do so, not only does this improve the accuracy of the result, and it's much easier than manually updating the information, but if you copy the information and do not modify it, you'll be less likely to be selected for verification of your FAFSA. So that can save you some time and hassle later. In fact, there are some colleges that require all the students to use the data retrieval tool, because not only does it save the students time and effort, it saves the schools time and effort. And final question from Matthew: is this presentation going to be available for future reference? This is such great information. I would like my husband to see this. I believe they will have a replayable recorded version of this presentation for people to view at other times. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope you find it helpful, and good luck with your pursuing your college dreams. Thank you.